Hello everyone and welcome back to the Academia and Research Collective. My name is Darren Lau and today we are going to be going over the presentation part of the research process. Now this will be our last video in this mini-series about the introduction to research, and we're going to wrap things up with the presentation part because by now you've tested everything, you've even written about your research in research paper, but it is time for you to present it, especially if you want to participate in things like science fairs or ICEF. This is what this video is going to be about. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. Now, this video is going to focus a lot about the communication part, right? In this presentation part, I'm especially going to try to emphasize communication, especially in front of those science fair judges so that you can score high and win those awards. Now, here is the basic structure of the presentation that I like to follow. First, I start with some kind of hook or introduction. Now, it's different for different levels of research. I think, if you're watching this as like a middle schooler doing middle school science fairs, you can have a more creative, less formal hook and introduction always works great. But I think for things like ICEF, you don't necessarily need like a hook or introduction that like asks the question, like, have you ever wondered, or stuff like that. If you want to just jump straight in and talk about your problem, or your introduction can just be like, a little bit about, what you used, or mainly focusing on the problem, I think that's the best. So it really depends on your level, but some sort of introduction is always great. Next, you always want to talk about your problem, right? What issue we're trying to solve? Why does it matter? Like, is this problem affecting a lot of people? Is this literature gap or like this gap in knowledge significant in some way? Like, talk about that, right? Emphasize to your judges why the problem you're solving is important and why it needs to be solved. And then you want to talk about your solution, right? Like, what did you do? Also in here is where you want to throw in your hypothesis and engineering goals. Go through, hypothesis, engineering goals, your guiding questions. It's basically the videos in order, and then talk about your methodology, right? In detail, go through methodology. If there's photos on your science fair board, point to those, talk about those. Basically talk about your entire research process. This is the solution part, and you want to be specific. But you don't want to be so specific that you bore the judges, right? The judges have a limited amount of time for each project. Talk about the most important parts of the project, the most salient parts of your project, and focus on those parts, but try to hit everything we've talked about in past videos, like research topic, question, hypotheses, engineering goals, and methodology. And then your results, right? What did you find? Show graphs, show data that you've got, line graphs, pie charts, all of those things we've talked about. And then you can also mix in your analysis here, right? Great things to talk about during the science fair is a comparison, right? I've talked about this before. If you can compare your results against others, this is a really powerful tool. You should talk about it here. So the results is where you do your data and your analysis. A bit different from the research paper. Remember, where we separated those. In this part, since science fair presentation is often time limited, you can combine these parts and kind of talk about your data as you do analysis of it. And then the impact part. Why is this significant? What do your results mean? And then also talk about the future, right? No research just ends. And I think, a lot of the science or rubrics themselves have things that give points for if, researchers can talk about what they want to do next. So always have something baked into the future, right? Like, maybe this research could be applied to some whole different field. Maybe you're already improving on what you've already researched. It doesn't matter. Just talk about the future and then wrap everything up. Now, here are some delivery tips that I like to go over. Firstly, speak slowly and clearly. Don't rush, right? Even though there's a time constraint, as long as you practice, which I'll talk about later, you should be able to say everything you need to, talk about all your clear points without having to rush, because what's worse is that you're rushing through it, your judge can't take notes in time, and then they miss something important. We don't want that, right? So clearly and slowly, make eye contact. That's very important. If you know your research well, you don't really even need to look at your board. You can gesture to your board, which I always suggest, but look your judge in the eye, talk to them, talk to them just as a human being, and you are the person that knows your project the best, so you should have the confidence to do that. And then use your hands naturally, right? Point to gestures, visuals, graphics, charts, images. What's best for judges is, if these judges are hearing like tens and tens of projects for, however long they're judging, they're going to inevitably start maybe tuning some stuff out, right? Maybe you're getting lucky and your judge is a bit tired or whatnot. These are things that can happen. Point to images and graphs, right? Those things are things they can understand super easily, right? Like I said before, if you create, visually appealing graphs and images that really show how your research stood out compared to past research, that's all very powerful. And then, of course, breathe, pause, and emphasize. Take breaths when necessary. You don't want to, just keep talking, and then you get lightheaded or something. That's very bad. Pause, right? And pause and emphasize kind of go together, because when you're pausing, you're showing your judges that this is important, right? If I'm talking about the piece of data that really shows how my project was significant, I want to emphasize that and pause and let the judge process that. So these are just some quick delivery tips. And body language and confidence is also super important when presenting. Stand up straight, shoulders back. Those are basic things. You've heard all of those before. But don't sway or fidget around, right? When you're talking, don't, if your hands are going to be doing something, they should be gesturing or emphasizing, right? That's the best thing to do with your hands during presentations. And then smile genuinely. Don't give like a fake smile. But best place to smile is at the beginning and throughout the presentation and at the end when they're leaving. Like, I always like to introduce myself at the beginning, nice handshake, smile at them, and just ask them how they are and if they're ready. That's always a great way to start. And then, like I said again, use purposeful hand gestures. Like a handshake at the beginning and the end is great. It always just lightens the mood a bit more and just makes, and then it also lets the judges know that you're serious about your research and that you want to present to them. That's why I always do that. And it's also because those first thoughts matter, right? If you're giving them a handshake, you're letting them know that you're into your research project and you're excited to present to them. Those can help you on your rubric, definitely. Now, questions are going to be an inevitable part of it, right? It depends on the judge. Judges might ask questions while you're presenting in the middle of your research. They'll chime in, right? If you're talking about something, they might lightly and nicely interrupt you to ask a question. That's okay. Or maybe they'll let you present everything, and at the end they'll have questions to ask you. It doesn't matter. Here's the best steps to deal with questions, right? Listen fully. Don't interrupt. Let them finish the train of thought first. If you don't understand the question, don't panic. Just clarify, right? Did you mean to say this, or like, are you specifically asking about this part, right? That's okay. And then, answer honestly. What I mean is, if they ask a straightforward question that they're like, talk about like things that went wrong, great. You can answer that probably pretty straightforward. But if there's a thing that you really don't know, that's okay. You can just be honest and that would be a great thing to test next time when I do this, especially in my future work. Or, that's a good question. I really didn't look into that perspective. That's okay. And the judges don't expect you to literally have covered every single basis, or, they expect you to do work in the future. So if there's a question you genuinely don't know, just, accept and say that you don't know it. Obviously don't be like, oh, I don't know that. Like handle it professionally. And lastly, don't get defensive. Don't get aggressive at your judges. I think that should be a given. And to score high, these are my kind of basic tips for scoring high. Talk about the iteration process. Did you have to change your engineering goals? Your design and methodologies especially, right? What went wrong during it? Something has always gone wrong during every science project, right? So talk about what you had to change. Maybe in the beginning of your project, you thought you were going to do this process, but then as you research, you're like, no, this process will actually be better. Great. Judges love to see that you're learning along the way as well. And this is that iterative process. I've seen a lot of science fair rubrics that give high points to researchers who talk about how they iterated, what they've learned, and the mistakes they've made. Once again, building on that, the errors and limitations, right? What are the limitations of research? Mention those. That's perfectly fine. I mean, there's limitation sections of very prominent research papers, because those researchers know that, they likely weren't able to cover every single thing, or maybe there were some sources of error. Talk about those and admit those. Once again, if a student is able to list and think about their errors and limitations, that can score you even higher points. Like I mentioned earlier, also talk about the future, right? Next steps. Can this research be applied anywhere else? Are you taking this somewhere else? Are you trying to, talk to other researchers about this? Are you going to continue working on this? Are you going to turn this into like a year 2 project where you build on it? Talk about that. And then also lastly, marketability. This one's a bit different, especially if it's like an invention or like an engineering project. I love talking about the marketability, like, this project, if it were to be sold, it would be able to enter the market. Talk about that. I think that adds a layer of complexity to your research project, because, people are going to be focusing on the research. But I like to say, like, after I focused on my research, I want to talk about the real tangible benefits of my product or my project, and the marketability is something that is really, really good. And it depends on the project. Some project, might just be testing something that, doesn't really have much to do with marketability. But if you can talk about marketability, I always think it's a good thing to add. And here are some common pitfalls. First is reading off your poster word for word, right? If you just have your poster here, you're just looking at it and reading it, and like reading it off of like a script, that's going to show your researchers first that, well, the judges, I mean, that you don't really know your project well, right? If you know your project well, you should just be able to talk off the top of your head about your project. But if you're just reading what's on your poster board, that's going to be boring for the judges. You're not making eye contact with them. They might tune some stuff out, and it also doesn't add any new information, right? The board is here to supplement you, right? So if you're just reading the board, great. The judges can read as well, right? So don't just read off your poster board word for word. Add in your own stuff, right? That's why I always encourage people when they make the boards, and I think I'll do a separate mini series later talking about creating a poster board. But when you create a poster board, I like to add more images than I have significant amounts of text, just because gesturing the images and supplementing it with what I'm talking about is always more powerful. And then going over time is another issue. Practice over time, right? Practice makes perfect with presentations. Practice, right? The days leading up to a competition or something, just practice. And I'll go over practice tips in just a second, but always remember, practice makes perfect. Overloading of text, like I talked about earlier, the board, if it's literally just covered in paragraphs, that's going to be less effective than if we're images and then that you were talking about what those images mean in their significance, or graphs and data table. And then using jargon without explanation. So for this one, it kind of depends on your fair, right? For like a local county science fair, the judges, might not be like all PhDs in your field, right? So if there's complicated terms, you should explain them. But when you get to things like ICEF, it depends on your independent judge, right? If your international science fair judge is someone who's like a PhD, well-respected researcher, you might not need to explain the terms. I still like to occasionally, just because it shows the judges that you know what you're talking about, but depends on the context, right? And, also sometimes they let public citizens come and view projects, and if you're showing, a person, maybe it's someone's dad talking about your project and just throwing all these buzzwords at them, that's not a particularly effective presentation. Explain your buzzwords depending on the context, though. And then lastly, not rehearsing, right? Goes back to the practice thing. Speaking of not rehearsing, though, here are some practice tips. Practice out loud. Don't practice in your head, right? Because what you're saying, what you're thinking, kind of come out as two different things, especially if you're under pressure in front of a real science fair judge. Time yourself, right? It depends on each fair. I've done fairs where there were time limit on presentations. I've done fairs that there weren't time limits. If there aren't time limits, I would still try to keep it reasonable, within a reasonable time length. This depends on your project and especially what level you are, right? If you're a middle schooler, just make sure you touch on everything. What I like to say is I just like to touch on every single point on my board that I've made into a section, right? I've got a hypothesis or engineering goal section. I've got a methodology section. I've got a results section. I've got an analysis section. I've got a future work section. I just want to talk about all of those different sections. I definitely don't want to go over time. The max limit I found is like 10 minutes. I would not even go over 10 minutes. But there's been time limits of 5 minutes. So it depends. Read your competition rules, but also just be reasonable, because those judges are not just judging you. They have a bunch of other projects to judge. So just be reasonable about your time. Also gets feedback from someone unfamiliar with your topic. I always present it to my parents about my research, even though they might not have understood a lot about AI or augmented reality, because that's not their expertise. They didn't know much about it. If I'm able to explain it in a way that gets all of the technical points across while still being able to help my parents understand, that's super powerful, because that means that you really know your stuff. Because the best way to check if you know something is that if you can explain it in a simple manner while still getting all the technical details across. That's very important. Also, record yourself presenting and then rewatch it. That's also great to practice, to see, especially what you're doing with your hand gestures, if you're doing fidgeting, or is your like body posture good. Right? All those things are great things that you can get from recording yourself, or you can practice in front of a mirror. That's something that I've seen people do. I don't personally do it, but I know it's worked for people because they can just see themselves in real time as they're presenting to see if they need to fix anything. So these are all great practice tips, but just remember, practice, practice, practice. And so really, that's it. I think the last thing I want to talk about is overarching theme is just confidence. If you have confidence, these things will come to you, right? If you have confidence, you'll be able to talk to your judges without reading from your poster board. If you have confidence, your body language and your posture will be good. If you have confidence, whenever a judge asks you a question, you'll be able to answer it well. So it's just a theme of confidence. And I think how you can build confidence is by knowing your research well and practicing. So I emphasize again, confidence is this overarching theme, and with confidence, I think you'll be very successful in your presentations. So Yeah, there we are. This was the last video in the Academia Research Collective's first little mini series on research. We've gone through a lot here, from choosing a research question, doing literature reviews, creating choosing a research topic, engineering hypotheses goals, methodology, writing a research paper, and now presentations. This was a great mini series. I thank you for watching and watching all of these videos from ARC. It means a lot to me, and I hope that from this mini series you'll be able to gain more skills in the research area. I'm going to produce more videos in the future, talking about things like creating science fair boards, or maybe using tools more in depth like Zotero, or how to write a research paper, and even go even more in depth and show you the entire process. But I wanted this series to be kind of like an introduction mini series to a person who might be new to research. I hope that I've helped you along your research journey. Thank you very much for watching the Academia Research Collective, and I'll see you next time.